Hello, friend. I'm Charlie, and I'm glad you're here. I've found that the stories worth telling are rarely the loud ones. They're the small, quiet turns that we barely notice until years later, when we look back and realize that was the moment everything started to shift. The one I want to share with you today is like that. It crept up on me slowly, over the better part of my life, and it taught me more about honesty and patience than almost anything else I've lived through. I still remember the day it started, though at the time I didn't know it was the beginning of anything. I was maybe 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my parents' bedroom while my mother got ready for a wedding. The late afternoon light was coming through the window in that warm, syrupy way it does in early autumn, and I remember the smell of her perfume, something floral and a little bit spicy, and the soft rustle of tissue paper as she pulled a dress out of a garment bag. It was the color of a ripe plum, with small buttons down the back that she couldn't quite reach, and she asked me to help her with them. "Careful, sweetheart, don't pull too hard," she said, laughing a little as my small fingers fumbled with the tiny fastenings. I remember watching the fabric settle against her, the way it moved when she turned to check herself in the mirror, and feeling something I couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It wasn't longing, not yet, not in any way I understood. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you hear a song for the first time and somehow already know the words. I didn't think about it again for a long time, not consciously anyway. But looking back now, I think that was the first thread of something that would take me almost 2 decades to fully understand. I grew up in a small house at the end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where the 4th of July meant a block party and Halloween meant every porch light left on until 9. My father worked at a hardware store he eventually came to manage, steady and practical in the way of a man who fixed things with his hands and trusted what he could see and touch. My mother taught piano lessons out of our living room 3 afternoons a week, and the sound of scales and stumbling little melodies is stitched into every memory I have of home. I had one older brother, Danny, 4 years ahead of me, who was everything a father might picture when he pictures a son. Danny played baseball, Danny got dirty, Danny wrestled with our cousins at Thanksgiving until somebody's lamp got knocked over. I loved Danny. I want to say that clearly, because so much of what I'm about to tell you might sound like I resented him, and I never did, not really. But I was aware, even young, that I was a different kind of boy than he was. I didn't like getting dirty. I liked colors and patterns and the particular satisfaction of things matching. I liked helping my mother fold laundry because I liked the textures, the crisp cotton of my father's work shirts against the slippery drape of my mother's blouses. I noticed things other boys my age didn't seem to notice, the way a scarf could change an entire outfit, the way certain shades of blue looked different depending on the light. None of this seemed strange to me as a young child, because children don't yet know what's supposed to be strange. It only started to seem strange when I noticed the way people reacted to it. I was 8 when I first tried on one of my mother's scarves without asking. She had gone to pick up Danny from practice, and I was home with our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Petrosky, who mostly let me do as I pleased as long as I didn't leave the yard. I went into my parents' room. I'm still not sure why. Some pull I didn't examine, and I opened the drawer where my mother kept her scarves folded in neat little squares. I picked one, pale yellow with small white flowers, and I tied it around my neck the way I'd seen her do, and I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I don't have the words even now to fully describe what I felt looking at myself in that mirror. It wasn't a costume. It wasn't pretend, the way it might feel putting on my father's work boots and clomping around the house. It felt like something clicking into place, quiet and unremarkable and true. I remember smiling at my reflection, an easy, unguarded smile, the kind I didn't often see on my own face. Then I heard the garage door, and I panicked, yanking the scarf off so fast I nearly tore it, stuffing it back into the drawer, smoothing it flat with shaking hands. My heart was pounding as though I'd done something terrible, though nobody had told me it was terrible. Nobody needed to. I already understood, in that instinctive way, children absorb the world's expectations, that this was not something boys were supposed to want. For years after that, I locked the feeling away in some private room in the back of my mind and mostly forgot to visit it. Childhood moved on the way it does, full of other things, school and friendships, and the small daily dramas that feel enormous when you're young. I made a good friend in 3rd grade, a girl named Willa who lived 2 streets over, and we spent hours playing dress-up in her enormous walk-in closet, her mother's old prom dresses and costume jewelry spread across the carpet like treasure. With Willa, it felt safe. It felt like play. Nobody questioned 2 children playing dress-up. Not at that age. Not yet. I remember one afternoon in particular, Willa handed me a soft pink cardigan that had belonged to her aunt and said, "This would look so pretty on you, Charlie." She said it so simply, the way children say true things before they learn to filter them, and I remember pulling it on and feeling that same quiet click of rightness I'd felt with the scarf. Willa didn't think anything of it. She just moved on to the next dress, the next tiara, chattering about our imaginary kingdom. But I carried that afternoon with me for years, held it close like a small stone in my pocket, evidence that once, somewhere, this hadn't felt wrong. By the time I was 10 or 11, the world had started teaching me otherwise. I don't think anyone in my family ever said anything cruel to me directly, not in those early years, but I absorbed the lessons anyway, the way you absorb the temperature of a room without anyone telling you it's cold. I noticed that my father's face would tighten, almost imperceptibly, if I lingered too long near my mother's side of the closet. I noticed that Danny, without any real malice, would tease me for caring how my hair looked, for asking my mother's opinion on which shirt matched my shoes. "You're worse than a girl," he said once, laughing, not meaning to wound me, and it landed like a verdict anyway. So I got quieter about it. I didn't stop feeling what I felt, but I stopped showing it mostly. I still remember small, secret moments, though, tucked into ordinary days. Once, homesick from school with a fever, I spent an afternoon alone wrapped in my mother's silk robe over my pajamas, not for any reason except that it felt soft and comforting, the way a blanket does, except somehow more personal. I remember the particular quiet of that afternoon, sunlight moving slowly across the carpet, feeling for a few hours like I didn't have to perform anything for anyone. Middle school was harder. That's true for almost everyone, I think, that strange, raw stretch of years when your body is changing and your sense of self feels like wet clay, but I think it was especially disorienting for me because I was carrying something I didn't have language for. I remember gym class, the locker room, the particular anxiety of trying to be unremarkable in a space that felt like it was designed to make you feel exposed. I remember overhearing boys mock a classmate for wearing what they decided were girl jeans, a comment that seemed to come from nowhere and land like a stone through glass. And I remember going home that day and staring at my own closet for a long time, not because anything in it was remarkable, but because I was terrified of what might happen if anyone ever looked as closely at me. I want to be honest with you about something. There were years, particularly around 13 and 14, when I tried very hard to bury the part of myself I'd glimpsed in that mirror when I was 8. I told myself it was a phase, a strange childhood quirk I'd simply outgrow, the way you outgrow a fear of the dark or a habit of biting your nails. I threw myself into things I thought would prove something, joined the track team, though I was never particularly fast, cut my hair shorter than I liked, tried to laugh along when the other boys made jokes that made something in my chest go tight and small. I got good at performing a version of myself that felt safe, even as it felt increasingly like wearing a mask that didn't fit. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was someone I felt strangely close to during those years, though we never spoke directly about any of this. Grandma Eleanor lived about 40 minutes away, in a small house that smelled like lavender and old books, and I used to visit her most Sundays. She was a seamstress in her younger years, and she still had a sewing room full of fabric scraps and spools of thread in every color you could imagine. I loved that room. I loved sitting on the little stool in the corner while she worked, watching her hands move with a confidence and gentleness that seemed like its own kind of magic. "You have a good eye, Charlie," she told me once when I pointed out that 2 fabrics she was considering for a quilt square didn't quite sit right together. Not everyone notices things like that. I didn't tell her why I noticed. I didn't fully understand it myself yet. But I remember feeling, in that small sewing room, one of the only places in my life where a part of me was allowed to exist without explanation or apology. High school brought its own complications. I made a small, tight circle of friends, kids who were a little bit on the margins themselves, kids who read too much or cared too much about music nobody else liked, or simply didn't fit the mold of what our particular school considered normal. Among them was a boy named Theo, who I grew close to over long conversations at lunch and even longer phone calls at night. Theo was the first person I ever came close to telling. It happened almost by accident during my sophomore year. We were at his house, his parents out for the evening, watching some movie neither of us was really paying attention to, and somehow the conversation turned to the things we were each afraid of. Theo told me he was afraid nobody would ever really know him, that he spent so much energy managing what people thought of him that sometimes he forgot who he actually was underneath it. It was such a raw, unguarded thing to say that something in me loosened, and before I'd fully decided to, I found myself saying, "I know what you mean. There's this thing about me. I don't even really understand it myself. I told him haltingly about the scarf, about the sewing room, about the strange comfort I found in things I wasn't supposed to want. I remember my heart hammering so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. Theo was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for anything: laughter, disgust, that particular kind of silence that means someone is trying to figure out how to leave the room without being rude. Instead, he said, "That doesn't seem like a big deal to me, Charlie. I mean, it's clearly a big deal to you, and I get that, but it doesn't change anything about how I see you." I don't think Theo fully understood what I was telling him. Not really. I don't think I fully understood it myself. But his easy acceptance meant more to me than he probably ever knew. It was the first time I'd said any of it out loud to another human being, and the world hadn't ended. That was a small revelation in itself. Over the next couple of years, I let myself explore quietly, carefully, in small private ways. I started buying a few things of my own, nothing dramatic: a soft cardigan in a color I liked, a scarf I told my mother I'd bought for a friend's gift and then never gave away. I kept them in a shoebox at the back of my closet, beneath old school projects and outgrown shoes, and some nights, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, I would take them out and simply sit with them, sometimes wearing them for an hour before carefully folding them away again. It wasn't about looking a certain way for anyone else. It was about that same quiet click of rightness I'd felt at 8 years old, the sense of coming home to some small, true room inside myself. I want to pause here and say something that took me a long time to understand, because I think it matters. For a while, I was ashamed of how ordinary these feelings actually were once I stopped fighting them. I'd expected, I think, some dramatic revelation, some moment where everything about myself resolved into a clean, simple story. Instead, it was quieter than that, more like slowly turning up the brightness on a room that had always been there, just dim. The things I wanted weren't extravagant or complicated. I wanted to feel like the outside of me matched something true on the inside. I wanted the freedom to choose a soft fabric or a certain color without a chorus of imagined voices telling me it wasn't allowed. My senior year of high school was when things started to shift more visibly, though still gradually, still carefully. My mother found the shoebox. I remember the sick drop in my stomach when I came home from school and saw it sitting open on my bed, the cardigan and the scarf folded neatly on top, my mother sitting in the chair by my window with an expression I couldn't quite read. I stood frozen in the doorway for a long moment, waiting for the ground to open up. "Sit down, sweetheart," she said, and her voice wasn't angry. It was something softer, more uncertain. I sat on the edge of the bed, as far from her as the room allowed, and waited. "I wasn't snooping," she said. "I was looking for the sweater I lent you last winter, and I found this instead. I wasn't sure what to think, so I thought I'd just ask you." I don't remember exactly what I said in response, some tangle of half-explanations and apologies, but I remember my mother listening without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of words, there was a long silence, and then she said something I've carried with me every day since. "Charlie, I held that scarf up and thought about how you used to help me get ready for things when you were small. Do you remember that? You always noticed everything, what matched, what didn't, what made something feel finished." She paused, and I watched her choose her next words carefully. "I don't fully understand this. I want to say that honestly, because I don't think you'd believe me if I pretended I did. But I love you, and I'm not going to stop loving you over a scarf, or a cardigan, or whatever this turns out to mean for you. I just want you to talk to me instead of hiding things in a shoebox." I cried, right there on the edge of my bed, in a way I hadn't let myself cry in years, all the accumulated weight of a decade of quiet secrecy finally finding somewhere to go. My mother moved to sit beside me and put her arm around my shoulders, and we sat like that for a long time, not saying much else, just letting the moment settle. Telling my father was harder, and it took longer, almost a full year after that conversation with my mother. I want to be honest that it wasn't a perfectly smooth road with him. My father is a good man, but he grew up in a house where certain things simply weren't discussed, where a narrow idea of what a man was supposed to be had been handed down to him without much question, and unlearning that took him time. When my mother eventually told him, gently, in her own way, there was a period of real distance between us, a few months where our conversations shrank down to logistics, dinner, chores, nothing that touched anything real. What changed things, slowly, was ordinary time spent together rather than any single dramatic conversation. He'd ask me to help him in the garage on weekends, the way he always had, and I'd go, and we'd work quietly side by side, and gradually the silence between us softened into something more like his usual gruff affection. One Saturday, months into that quiet thaw, he said, without looking up from the shelf he was repairing, "Your mother tells me you've been better lately, happier." I told him I was. He nodded, still not looking at me, and said, "Good. That's what I want for you. I don't always know what to do with all this, Charlie, but I don't want you unhappy on my account." It wasn't a grand declaration of understanding, but it was honest, and it was his own gradual way of telling me he was trying, and that meant more to me than a more polished speech might have. By the time I left for college, I felt like a slightly different person than the boy who'd hidden a shoebox at the back of his closet. Though the change had been so gradual, I couldn't point to a single day it happened. College gave me a kind of anonymity that let me experiment more freely, in a city a few hours from home, where nobody had known me as a child, where nobody carried preconceived notions of who I was supposed to be. I found a small, kind community there, other people figuring out their own versions of the same questions, and for the first time I started wearing some of what I'd only ever worn in private, out in the world, in small doses at first, then with growing confidence. I remember one particular evening, a friend's birthday gathering in a cramped apartment with string lights taped haphazardly to the ceiling, where I wore a deep green blouse I'd bought for myself with my own paycheck from the campus bookstore. I remember the small, ordinary miracle of nobody remarking on it, of the evening simply continuing, people laughing over cheap pizza and terrible music, and me standing among them feeling, for maybe the first sustained stretch of my life, entirely undivided, not performing one version of myself while hiding another, just Charlie, whole and present in the room. That doesn't mean every day since has been easy. I won't pretend to you that self-acceptance is a door you walk through once and never think about again. There have been setbacks, moments of doubt, family gatherings where I've quietly recalculated what felt safe to wear, friendships that couldn't hold the fuller version of who I am and gently fell away. Danny, my brother, took the longest of anyone in my family to come around, and even now our relationship carries a certain careful formality it didn't have when we were boys wrestling on the living room floor. I've made peace with the fact that not everyone's understanding arrives on the same timeline, or arrives at all, and that this says something about their own limitations, rather than about any failing in me. But I think of my grandmother's sewing room sometimes, all these years later, the quiet permission of that small space, and I try to build a life that has more rooms like that in it, more places where I don't have to explain or apologize for the shape of who I am. I think of the 8-year-old version of me standing in front of that mirror with a borrowed scarf, smiling an unguarded smile at his own reflection, and I try to honor that small, brave moment by not making him wait so long for happiness ever again. What I've come to understand, slowly, over years of quiet growth rather than any single lightning bolt revelation, is that identity isn't really about the clothes themselves, though the clothes can be a doorway. It's about honesty. It's about the exhausting cost of constantly editing yourself for an audience, and the particular unglamorous relief of finally setting that editing down. It's about learning that the people who truly love you can hold more complexity than you feared, even if they need time to grow into that capacity, and that the ones who can't were never quite offering you the kind of love you actually needed in the first place. I think about my mother often, the way she chose curiosity over judgment in that first conversation, the way she said she loved me before she said she understood me, trusting that understanding would come later, if it came at all. I try to extend that same patience to myself now, on the days when old shame tries to resurface, when some small internalized voice from childhood whispers that I'm still doing something wrong. I remind myself that the boy in the mirror wasn't wrong. He was just early, sensing something true about himself, long before the world had given him permission to say it out loud. Thank you for listening to my story. If something in my journey reminded you of your own, I hope you remember that growth often begins with the smallest, quietest moments. A scarf in a drawer, a friend's easy acceptance, a mother choosing love before she chooses to understand. You don't have to have it all figured out today. Take care of yourself, be patient with your own becoming, and I'll see you again in the next story. I'm Charlie.